Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Edward Hand. And to help us talk a little bit about Edward Hand, we are very fortunate to be joined by author David Price. David, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
Absolutely. Now, you've written several books about the American Revolution, some of which are very much based around Edward Hand to a degree. And notably, when we first spoke, you had mentioned his rolling battle at Assunpink Creek. So, before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about Edward Hand? Where was he from, and how did he get involved in the Revolution?
Okay, well, Edward Hand was an Irish immigrant. He was born in Ireland in 1744. We don't know much about uh, his early life there. He left in 1767, joined the 18th Royal Irish Regiment of Foot as a surgeon's mate, which I guess would be the functional equivalent of a physician assistant today. He had pursued medical studies informally at Trinity College in Dublin. I don't think he didn't actually matriculate there, but when I say medical studies, I'm using the term loosely in a 21st century context, obviously. Um, but he learned enough to, I guess, to qualify for that position. So he came to America in 1767, and he was serving at Fort Pitt, of course, on the site of present-day Pittsburgh, and got into learning about Indian medicine, Native American medicine, horticulture, engaged in some land transactions, earned enough money to purchase an officer's commission, and then he left the Army in 1774. It appears that he became somewhat disenchanted with British colonial policy. Perhaps it was a residue of his what he had experienced in Ireland growing up under um, British rule that treated the Irish as second-class citizens effectively. And so I think based on that experience, he was sympathetic to the, what was the growing movement, if you will, towards American independence in the early to mid 1770s. He moved to Lancaster, PA, got involved with a militia unit there, and he was an attractive commodity to the, shall we say, the Patriot military faction because of his background as a British soldier and also his knowledge of medicine, quote unquote. And he appears to have been a born leader. He became the colonel, first lieutenant colonel, then colonel of the 1st Pennsylvania Rifle Regiment in 1775, or maybe in early 76. And then his regiment marched, I'm sorry, I should say 1775. His regiment marched some 400 miles to Cambridge, Massachusetts to join the fledgling Continental Army after Washington had taken command there in mid 1775. They were the first unit from outside New England to join up with that army.
Excellent. And then, so he joins the Army, and then early on in the war, if I'm not mistaken, he ends up being appointed a Brigadier General.
Well, he becomes a brigadier general in early 1777, and then is assigned to command the detachment at Fort Pitt. Then, of course, he would serve in that capacity for the rest of the war, although he became Washington's adjutant general, chief administrative officer for the Army in 1781. He was the last um, Continental Army adjutant general in the Revolution. Then he was
Right.
breveted to major general in 1783.
And an adjutant general is,
My,
I'm sorry, an
I'm
adjutant
sorry,
general is basically someone who runs the business
administ-
of war.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, right. Handles personnel matters, issuing
right.
orders, that kind of thing.
HR.
My interest in you mentioned Assunpink Creek.
Well,
My
yeah, I was
interest
going to
in
ask you that when we spoke beforehand. You had mentioned that you think one of the most underrated engagements of the war seems to be Assunpink Creek, also known as the Second Battle of Trenton. Could you please elaborate
right,
for us on that?
and my interest in Hand, it relates to that. I remember going to, I'll put in a plug here for historic Rockford in Lancaster, PA, which is the historic site that's open to the public, and it was Edward Hand's last home, Georgian-style brick mansion that he built in 1794, and he lived there for the last 8 years of his life. And I know Sam Slaymaker, who's the ED there, will appreciate what I just said, I hope.
Hi, Sam.
And I went to speak there a few years ago, and they give a great tour, by the way. So I want to give them a plug. When I went to speak there a few years ago, I said to them, you may know him as General Hand. That's how they commonly refer to him. But to me, he will always be Colonel Hand. And I say that because it was in that role, or that rank, if you will, that I believe he was took the action or actions that I think arguably make him the most unsung patriot military hero, if you will, of the Revolution. I first got into him when I was doing my initial book, Rescuing the Revolution, which was about a select few, what I call unsung patriot heroes, who played an important role, I thought, in the 10 Crucial Days winter campaign of 1776-77. The 10 Crucial Days was when Washington's army won its first 3 significant victories of the war and changed the whole momentum of the contest, just when it appeared that the quest for independence was on the verge of final defeat.
Right.
So the 2 battles that bookend the Battle of Assunpink Creek, the first one being the attack against the Hessians on December 26, 1776, after the legendary Delaware River crossing. And then the last one was the Battle of Princeton on January 3rd, 77, the capstone event, if you will, of the 10 Crucial Days. But that middle battle, the second battle, Assunpink Creek or Second Trenton, whatever you want to call it, I made it, well, really the thesis of my second book, The Road to Assunpink Creek, that battle, even though it's been neglected by historians over the decades, in some cases totally ignored, started to change a little bit with David Hackett Fisher in Washington's Crossing, but still it's what I call the Rodney Dangerfield of battles. I would argue that it was the most pivotal event of the 10 Crucial Days and perhaps of the entire Revolution. And
So tell us,
certainly, I think the most underrated, most unappreciated moment of the Revolution.
So tell us, what does Edward Hand do in this battle that makes it so significant for him and for the battle itself?
Right, and I'm glad you asked.
What I'm here for.
And found himself commanding a multi-regimental force of about 1,000 men, who fought a delaying action over the course of several hours for most of the day on January 2nd, 77. Their mission was to slow up the advance of some 8,000 British and Hessian troops under General Cornwallis, Lord Cornwallis, who were marching from Princeton to Trenton to destroy Washington's army. So Cornwallis's objective was to get to Trenton, where Washington's army was, by mid-afternoon, so he would have enough daylight left. We're talking, early January now, to crush Washington's army once and for all. He wasn't able to do that. By the time his army got to Trenton, it was almost dark, and there would be some fierce fighting at Assunpink Creek, mostly in exchange of artillery fire in the twilight hours. But what was critical was that Cornwallis didn't get to Trenton in time to launch a full-scale coordinated attack on Washington's army, and that would allow Washington to pull off his great escape that night, make an end run around Cornwallis's left flank, go up to Princeton. After marching, they marched 12 miles in about 5 hours, and surprised the British, Cornwallis's rear guard, the small British force in Princeton. Now, the reason Washington was able to do that, was able to pull off this plan, was that those 1,000 American soldiers from PA, Maryland, Virginia, who were led by Colonel Edward Hand, fought such a stubborn and skillful delaying action against Cornwallis's much larger force. Hand was outnumbered by more than 6 to 1, somewhere between 6 to 1 and 8 to 1, I think. Um, they slowed up the British. It wasn't just Hand's men. Also, the road conditions were horrible because of all the rain the night before. There had been unusually warm temperatures, almost 40 degrees. So the road from Princeton to Trenton was a muddy morass, but most of the impediment, shall we say, that Cornwallis encountered was from Hand's men, especially the sharpshooters of his Pennsylvania regiment with their deadly American-made long rifles, who were, basically throughout the war, they would instill terror in the hearts of the enemy soldiers, and for very good
Yeah,
reason.
we've been speaking about, actually, it's funny you mentioned that we've been speaking about the Riflemen a lot on this channel recently. So it, again, comes back around to these, what at the time were fairly new weapons that were being
Right,
used very well and strategically by the Americans.
right. So I wrote in my book the road to Assunpink Creek. I said at one point, talking about these two factors that slowed up Cornwallis's march. One was the muddy road conditions from the rain, and the other was the resistance of Hand's men. So I said that you might say that in talking about these two factors, the weather was due to the hand of fate, and the American defense that day was due to the hand of Pennsylvania.
Fair enough. That's really well said. I do want to kind of footnote right now. But you keep mentioning him as Colonel Hand because you know him as Colonel Hand from your research. I'm more familiar with him as Brigadier General Hand, although we should note that he is given a brevet promotion at the end of the war to Major General. So technically, just to make things clear, we're talking about Major General Edward Hand. Though, like you said, this is really interesting how important he was to this particular battle. And if I'm not mistaken, George Washington makes his great escape, as you mentioned, but this is just about the same time that enlistments are ending and men are getting ready to leave, and Washington essentially, I don't want to say begs them, but calls on their how would you say, their better nature to continue supporting their cause, if I'm not mistaken, just
Right.
within
That happens.
days.
That happens. Well, I would say a couple of days
Days, yeah. Like,
before the battle that I was talking about, Assunpink Creek, because the thing that I think most prompted Washington to initiate that 10-day campaign when he did to cross the Delaware on Christmas night was because he knew he was going to lose at least half of his army if he didn't do something when those enlistments expired.
right. So
So you're right.
morale was extremely low at the time. So if it weren't for Edward Hand slowing down Cornwallis on his march, the morale was already low. Not to mention it wouldn't look good had they fought that battle.
Well, my opinion would be if Hand had failed in his mission, if Cornwallis had achieved his objective, he would have gotten to Trenton in time to essentially destroy Washington's army. Cornwallis was a good enough general. He was arguably the best field commander the British had. And he very quickly saw the vulnerability of the Americans' defensive position behind the Assunpink Creek. He saw how he could outflank them. And if he did, he could drive them up against the riverbank, and they had no boats. So it would have been like, well, I've compared it to an 18th century version of Dunkirk without any flotilla to rescue the Americans.
Right.
And I think it would have been the end of Washington's army. We can debate about whether it would have ended the revolution, but I think it would have been the end of Washington's army and probably the end of Washington, because he either would have been killed on the battle or he would have been, suspended from the end of a British rope.
Yeah, he would even be criticized after his successes. So, of course. Yeah. Well, Mr. Price, thank you so much for bringing us this fascinating story. We love underappreciated founders here, and obviously, the Battle of Assunpink Creek and Edward Hand in particular is very underappreciated. So, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Founder fans, I just want to point out, first of all, thank you to David Price for coming. Second of all, check out the links below. He has 3 books. They are all fascinating and excellent, including a new one, a relatively new one on John Hazlitt, who is another super underappreciated founder. TJ, Patriot, supporter on Patreon. I see you there. Thank you for coming. Mr. Adams, thank you for checking in. Everyone, check out the links below, or go see Mr. Price down at Washington's Crossing State Park, or I'm sorry, National Park, where he gives tours and is an historical interpreter. So thank you for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe for American Revolution 6 days a week. Thank you again to Mr. Price, and I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.